Objections? Good morning, everybody. My name is John Roach. I'm the chief of the Dam Safety Permits Division. This is a new division within our sediment stormwater dam safety program, but it's really an extension of our past dam safety practices. We've basically broken ourselves into two groups, still very linked and very much a team, but we're trying to optimize our resources and our staffing to make some of the changes that we'll be discussing in some of these presentations. So to, excuse me, to understand where we came from is an important part of understanding our current regulations and authorities and how we may need to adapt to changing and future conditions. At the heart of dam safety laws and regulations throughout the country and locally is the concept of risk-informed decision-making. We may not be aware we're making these risk-informed decisions, but we also acknowledge it's not practical or socially acceptable to spend incredible sums of money and energy to make the dam, the mythical dam that can't fail, right? So with an understanding of the risk that dams pose, we set our laws and regulations based on the societally acceptable and tolerable levels of risk. Of course, that social acceptance and tolerance of risk changes over time, just as the science of dam engineering evolves and some of the other factors we deal with, like a changing climate, happens. Now, in the history of dam safety, there are some notable examples that have dam failures that have shown a spotlight on the risks that dams pose, and they have shaped laws both nationally and locally. So before we start talking about the history of Maryland's regulations, let's investigate some of these historic dam failures. The first failure of note is the South Fork Dam failure, also known as the Johnstown flood in western Pennsylvania in 1889. This is a well-known event with at least 2,200 persons dead, an entire stream valley and all industry associated with it destroyed, 1,700 structures, about $500 million in damages projected to current money. This dam failure was the biggest non-wartime fatality event in our country until September 11th. So this had a major impact, and it kind of rattled the bones of everybody who was present at the time. This failure taught us great lessons on the importance of adequately addressing spillway capacity, and perhaps more importantly, the effects of allowing modifications to occur to a dam by non-engineers and without any regulation or oversight as to whether those were adequate modifications or not. Clearly, in this case, the changes that the dam owners had made were not very good. The second dam failure I'd like to talk about is a perhaps lesser known dam. It's the Austin Dam, also in Pennsylvania, which failed in 1911. This Austin Dam was a concrete gravity dam, and it was constructed by the Bayless Paper and Pulp Company. Basically, this was a company town, and the Bayless Paper Company needed additional water for their industrial processes. So they built it, and they felt like they needed more water. So they pressed the owner, the designer and the constructor to build it higher, and immediately problems started happening. The dam slid, the dam bent. This is a concrete masonry dam. It shouldn't do any of those, right? And eventually it failed, catastrophically, causing 78 deaths, basically the loss of the town, and $275 million in damages. So while from a technical side, this failure taught us great lessons on the importance of understanding dam foundations and structural design, it also taught us the importance of regulations and construction oversight and not bowing to pressure from owners to find the cheap fix and to build it bigger, faster, without adjusting your designs in the first place. The last dam failure I'll mention right now is another well-known failure. It happened in California in 1928. It's the St. Francis Dam failure. This dam was designed by William Mulholland, a famous person in the Los Angeles area. Mulholland Drive, perhaps you've heard of it. It was named after him. And he basically built the entire water supply system for the city of Los Angeles. And this was one of his dams. Now, it's important to note Mulholland was not an engineer, but yet here he was designing and constructing a dam a couple hundred feet tall, and it had problems as well. In fact, the dam failed around midnight after he had inspected it earlier the same day in the afternoon, declaring it to be perfectly adequate. This dam failed. It killed at least 430 people, although this being a very heavy agricultural area, it has supposed that there could have been many undocumented workers out there in the fields who could have been impacted as well. The failure caused $100 million in damages, destroyed the reputation of Mulholland, and again, what made the national news as to the risks and dangers that dams pose. Now, in response to the St. Francis Dam disaster, the California legislature created an updated dam safety program and eliminated many of their exemptions. You know, in Maryland, we have the small pond exemption, and we'll talk about how that kind of came about. But can you imagine in the 1920s in California, as long as a municipality was constructing the dam, they were exempt from any oversight. They could build it as tall as the St. Francis Dam, and the state had no power to step in and ensure that the design was adequate and the construction was adequate. In addition, in recognition of the fact that Mulholland, while he was a genius by many persons' eyes, he wasn't a trained engineer. So California passed laws to regulate civil engineering and became one of the first states to create a board of registration for professional licensure for engineers, land surveyors, and geologists. So these dam failures in California and Pennsylvania, among many others, shaped the initial framework nationally and in their localities for dam safety regulation. So, what was the beginning of regulation in Maryland like? Again, I'm going to point back to the fact that dam engineers must not be afraid to learn from failures, because these lessons learned drive regulation and improve the state of practice. And people in the state of Maryland recognize that. So these failures that had happened nationally, including our neighbor just to the north in Pennsylvania, combined with a severe drought in the 1930 to 31 timeframe, forced the General Assembly to create the first Water Resources Commission of Maryland. And they were tasked with understanding the regulation of water supply resources, which itself includes the regulation of dams and reservoirs. They are to prepare a report to include their findings, draft regulations and legislation to enact a program for controlling water supply and dams and reservoirs in the state of Maryland. They met for the first time nearly 90 years ago today, on September 22nd, 1931. And here's some of their meeting minutes from that meeting. After brief introductions and kind of the general discussion of the drought, the second topic that they talked about was dams and water supply. I'll read here. Another problem in the connection with water supply is the absence of any state control over the location, design, and construction of dams and reservoirs. Several large dams have been built in Maryland within the past few years with no state agency having any jurisdiction. The absence of state control may result in the failure of such structures, similar to the experiences noted in other states where no such regulations existed. I was really pleased when I read these meeting minutes, and this was the second bullet, because it clearly showed that this was on the forefront of their minds. And they were tasked with looking at regulations and developing them, and clearly they were drawing from states that had dam failures. Pennsylvania and California were some of the initial states that they used as models. So The result of the Water Resources Commission was new laws passed under Chapter 526 in 1933. It's interesting, these laws from 1933 really mirror our laws that exist today as it pertains to dam safety. There's been some changes, by some count 13 modifications to this law over time, but the intent has remained virtually unchanged, protecting public interests and safety by ensuring that dams are designed, constructed, and operated in an acceptable manner. So how did they do that? Well, they created permit requirements for the control of the construction and repairs of reservoirs, dams, and waterway obstructions. They included provisions for public hearings before the construction of dams, and the ability for the state to order dam owners to remove a dam if found to be unsafe. Now, again, that's almost verbatim exactly what some of the enabling laws that we operate under today deal with. As I read through the meeting minutes from multiple commission meetings, I see that these people who were developing these laws and regulations were pretty well versed in dam engineering, and their meeting minutes reflected that, showing that they were doing some pretty detailed review and approval of a number of dams that remain in existence today. And there were quite a few that had been built even before these laws and regulations, which I think loomed over them and weighed in their minds as they developed all of their recommendations. Some of them include Deep Creek Dam, which was completed in 1925. It's well known, clearly it's a very large dam and complex with its hydroelectric generating capacity and other features. The Conowingo Dam was completed in 1928. And then one of the linchpins of the Baltimore City water supply system, the Pretty Boy Dam, was well under construction by the time these laws came into effect and was completed in 1936. So large dams and the safety that they, risk to safety that they pose was well known in Maryland in the 1930s. So let's move forward a little bit into the 1950s and 60s. In this era of dam regulation in the state, there was a lot of bureaucratic shuffling, and a number of changes in regulations had occurred. But essentially, many of the tenets remain the same. So the Department of Water Resources was formed and combined its efforts with the Water Resources Commission in 1964. If you want to refer to some of the laws, Chapter 526 was then superseded by Article 96A. And this Water Resources Department included oversight of our reservoirs and waterway obstructions. Now that department was then absorbed by the Board of Natural Resources, which was then absorbed by the Department of Natural Resources in 1969. And the Water Resources Administration, which we were known in as MDE, which Jennifer mentioned was created in 1987, was created to regulate dams. So I mentioned a number of regulatory changes had occurred in this shuffling time period. Clearly, some of them were probably just to change references to departments and names, but there were many that dealt with exempting smaller ponds. These changes occurred in about 1950, 57, 65, and 72, and I'll give an example of some of the changes. Originally, Maryland allowed exemptions for small dams under 10 feet in height or less than 1 million gallons in volume. Moving forward, by 1950, there was some concept of a farm pond, and it could be exempted if it impounded 9 feet or less of water and had a surface area of less than 1.5 acres and a drainage area of less than 100 acres. And these kind of evolution of exemptions continued and sometimes got complex. There were some that said if you're east of the B&O Railroad, there's one criteria, and west of the B&O Railroad, there's another criteria. So we mentioned farm ponds. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, you could call this the farm pond era. Well, what does a farm pond mean, really? Well, I'll start by saying it all starts with the Soil Conservation Service, which is now the NRCS and the Soil Conservation District. So I apologize if I flip back and forth within some terminology here, but so we all understand we're talking about what today is our local and state level SCDs. The first chief of the Soil Conservation Service had a famous saying, "Eroded soils make for eroded people." And that might be the new model of the SSDS program too, because it's just a nice thing to say. So the history of the Soil Conservation Service really came from the Dust Bowl era in the 1930s. And they were tasked with providing technical assistance and supervision with attention to the erosion and degradation of farmland throughout the country. And that attention to farmers and agricultural uses transitioned a little bit and expanded into farm pond as well. Farm pond design and construction for many of the agricultural needs that you would have for water, irrigation, livestock, fire suppression, and so on. Now, at this point, though, by the 1960s, there were no small pond exemptions explicitly in law and regulation. But if you were building a farm pond under the supervision of the local soil conservation district, applicants had to notify the state of their intent to build the structure, and the state issued an exemption from state permitting so long as construction remained supervised by that local district. In 1969, the SCD law was amended and authorized these districts to work with all people within their district, not just agricultural uses. So this signifies a shift and a mindset towards urban issues and stormwater issues that we're still dealing with today. All right, so we're talking about farm ponds and the role of SCD here in the design and construction supervision, but this really still doesn't explain how we got to this kind of multi-tier system in the state of Maryland, where the department, which by law and regulation has the overall authority, but it has been delegated down for certain small ponds to the local soil conservation districts. So how did that happen? Let's take a step back to 1954 with PL 566, the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act. This was a federal piece of legislation that authorized the Conservation Service to assist local sponsors in planning for large watershed protection and flood prevention projects. So some of these PL 566 dams exist in Maryland today. You may know them in Charles County. I believe it's the Gilbert Run dams. In St. Mary's County, it's St. Mary's State Park. Out in Garrett County, there's a number of dams. We call them the Youghiogheny dams 1 through 6 with some exceptions, and so on. So these were large dams, and they were really meant to provide regional control of water, primarily for protecting agricultural use, but not explicitly. Now, through this PL 566, the SCS became a leading agency in the design of dams and small ponds. They built thousands of them throughout the country. By some number, it's over 29,000 dams they assisted with them being the lead agency on over 11,000 of those. So they developed quite a knowledge base, both a personal, institutional knowledge base of their staff, but they developed standard design criteria and worksheets and manuals and design guidance, some of which we still see in use today in some of our submissions that we see in our shop. So the benefit of this national expertise is that expertise flowed down to the state and local level branches, and people could tap into that for design of smaller farm ponds and other similar size structures. Here's an example of the location of a lot of those watershed projects sponsored by the SCS. You'll see it really extended throughout the entire eastern part of the country and some in the west, though much of the water resources in the west is managed by the Bureau of Reclamation. And of these 1,300 projects, there's over 12,000 dams. So you can see from this broad extent, they were able to capture lots of different local conditions, local practices, and develop all of that information into a national guidance and framework for design and construction of dams. All right, so that explains a little bit of where the knowledge came for the conservation districts and how that was built up over time. Marching into 1970, Maryland passed the Sediment Control Act, which allowed soil conservation districts to approve sediment control plans. Now, concurrently, after that legislation was passed, the State Attorney General's office interpreted this act to require stormwater management for the control of the sediment as well. So, in the 1960s and early 70s, the whole concept of stormwater management was growing in the state of Maryland, and just, it took a while to fully launch, but these ideas were present in many people's minds. With that understanding that the conservation districts had this ability to tap into the resources from the national level NRCS offices, and in coordination with the Water Resources Administration, changes were made that allowed the local agencies to approve small ponds as opposed to just supervise the construction. Excuse me. So those small pond approvals began in accordance with our favorite Practice Code 378 and the now defunct Engineering Memorandum Maryland 2 that was developed. The first draft of 378 was written in 1972, and you can see here, just like the regulations I mentioned previously, it had many revisions over time. These were living documents. As new issues came about, new practices were known, they were able to be revised. You'll see 77, 81, 91, 92, a pretty frequent set of revisions until we hit 2000. And what's happened since? Well, that evidence that has shown that these documents were living and evolving from the 50s basically through the 1990s is important, because it shows that we need to, we shouldn't ignore the documents. We do need to keep them current with the current times. All right, now that kind of explains where we were in the 1970s. The 1970s was a really important decade in terms of modernizing the overall state of dam safety in the country. So again, let's point to some new, specific dam failures that continue to refine our laws and regulations. The first one of those is the Teton Dam failure in Idaho in 1976. This dam was built by the United States Bureau of Reclamation and failed on its first filling. I mentioned earlier, the USBR manages most of the water resources in the west of the country. Just like the NRCS, they were preeminent, internationally known and respected dam designers and constructors. Yet, through a number of organizational and technical factors that they overlooked, they created a dam that was a ticking time bomb for failure. And they should have known it, because there was a similar dam, I believe also in Idaho, that nearly failed a few years earlier from the exact same defects. That's the Fontenelle Dam. But they didn't learn. So the result was 11 dead, nearly $2 billion in damages, and just massive public distrust in the safety of dams throughout our country. On a smaller scale, but perhaps more important, was the Kelly Barnes Dam, which failed in northern rural Georgia in 1977. The Kelly Barnes Dam is located just upstream of the Toccoa Falls Bible College. In between the dam and the college is Toccoa Falls, which by all accounts is a beautiful, large natural waterfall. But unfortunately, when the dam failed, that large waterfall exacerbated the flooding downstream, failed in the middle of the night, left 39 people dead, many of them students sleeping in their dormitories, caused about $10.5 million of damages. But it's important to note in 1977 who was president. It was Jimmy Carter. So basically, this dam failed in his backyard, so to speak, and caught his attention. The next day, the First Lady was on the scene, talking to responders, talking to victims of the flood. And by all accounts, we have heard this really shook the President and the First Lady to their core and drove home the importance of dam safety in the country. Now, I'll mention the National Dam Inspection Act of 1972 is a few years before this. But like a lot of things in government, it takes time to build momentum to really develop large programs. And it took a long time to get this Inspection Act passed. For people who have been around a while or looked at larger dams, you'll may be familiar with the term Phase 1 inspections. This Inspection Act of 1972 was basically the government's response to a number of failures or near failures. They didn't really know what dams were out there. So they started taking an inventory. And in this inventory process, these Phase 1 inspections were completed that provided a baseline of information about the dam and any existing defects at that time or inadequacies. Maryland jumped in pretty quickly and started participating in these Phase 1 inspections, and in fact writing some of them in 1973. And we started developing our own inventory to add to the national dam inventory. But it took until a few years later to actually form the Dam Safety Division. No doubt failures like Kelly Barnes and Teton helped accelerate all of these efforts. And there's a gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Gee. If you look up, you can Google him, it's G-E-E is his last name. He's done some wonderful historic papers about the history of dam safety in this era and how it just was fits and starts to develop. But these failures really pushed us along. So dam safety in Maryland as a division kicked off in 1978. We wrote some regulations, and as Jennifer mentioned, they remain largely unchanged. The laws, of course, had already been in effect since 1930, but now we have specific people to point to administer those laws and hopefully evolve them over time. All right, so now we have established the history of our small pond exemptions and how the dam safety program started, and that shows us where we are today, basically. Today, I'm calling ourselves in the retrofit era. That's where we're all dealing with not necessarily building new structures, but we're retrofitting them for a variety of reasons. First, let's remind ourselves of the current laws and regulations just so we can refresh. Dam safety, and including small ponds, is governed by law in Maryland in Environment Article 5-501 through 5-514. Regulations, which are promulgated to enact those laws, are section 26.17.04. Now that's broad, and that covers all of waterway construction, and it details a lot of the permitting requirements for dams. But 26.17.04.05 is specific and actually has some specific criteria for dams. Now within 0405 is the reference and the incorporation of Maryland 378. So it's important to recognize that 378 does not encapsulate the total of regulations and laws in the state of Maryland. It's a portion of them. Links to both the regulations and the law are available on the dam safety website if you're interested in reading them in detail. But a few pertinent definitions I'll provide right now. A dam means any obstruction, wall, or embankment, together with its abutments and appurtenant works, along or across any stream, heretofore or hereafter constructed for the purpose of storing or diverting water, or for creating a pool upstream of the dam, as determined by the administration. So that as determined provides us some leeway in terms of how we define a dam, because we're not looking to regulate your backyard swimming pool, but we need to have some flexibility based on the type and construction. And note, this includes the reservoir area, which is important, and I'll bring up why that's important as well. So now we know what a dam is. Let's define a little bit further. And regulations say a person shall obtain upon application a permit to construct, reconstruct, or repair any reservoir, dam, or waterway construction. Again, reservoirs in there, and I'll note why that's important in a moment. We do have some recent legislation that allows the department to designate other entities as acceptable small pond approval entities. And right now, the Maryland Department of Transportation, State Highway Administration, is undergoing a long process to develop policies and procedures and other legal documents for us to allow to designate that authority to them. But I'll point out, nothing in the legislation or regulations should be considered to limit the department's authority over dams, ponds, and reservoirs. And this has become up more and more of a problem because of how 378 and other documents and regulations may be in need of revisions. Nothing explicitly enables the conservation districts to weaken or waive requirements. So how do we get around that? I think we all have workarounds for where there's ambiguity or regulations don't necessarily match up with the current state of practice of design of some of these ESD facilities. But we are in kind of a gray area here on these workarounds if they're fully in compliance with the law and regulations. So I mentioned that there's not a large push to build new ponds and dams these days, but with the implementation of total maximum daily loads and MS4 permits, retrofitting existing structures is the hot item of the day, right? I think we all know that. That's why we're sitting in this presentation today. And these retrofits might modify the dam and the reservoir, but they also require ensuring that the dam and reservoir are in good shape, because many of them are at the end of their useful design life. So I think it's good. I think it's good to include the pond integration and the stormwater management because, you know, we can't work in towers. We are all part of a collaborative community, and this integration is good. We have noticed that many SCDs have developed memorandums with the local stormwater management review agencies to do the technical review for the 378 ponds. And that brings up some questions in our mind about, is this a proper thing? Now, we're looking at some of your survey results and just some of our personal experiences and wondering, is this tied into the transition of SCD staff and the loss of institutional knowledge and expertise through retirements or finding other employment? It also begs the question, is this legal? We had a conversation about this the other day, and you know, can this delegation really meet the intent of our regulations or not is an open question, which then further begs, does the small pond delegation to the conservation districts, does that model still work? Should it be improved? How would it be improved? We want to explore why as part of this series. We're not about to make any drastic changes or here to upend your lives, but you know, as we're learning and as we're observing, these are questions that are popping into our head, and we want to make sure that we're both meeting the intent and the letter of regulations and doing what's right for the public. As a first step, if you do have a memorandum with a local agency to review for stormwater and 378 together, it's our opinion that we need to be included in these documents, particularly now. We're at a tipping point. We recognize the regulations and guidance need to be updated, so they will change. And we'd like to have some input into these legal documents to ensure that A, the state oversight still exists, but also that they're flexible to adapt to any of these changes as they go forward. You know, I discussed how the SCDs gain their knowledge and that kind of comfort level to be doing the technical review. And we're wondering, are the counties maintaining a workforce that is current on the state of the practice locally and nationally? And do they have the resources they need to perform these reviews outside of just a blind or blanket reading of 378? Again, 378, as we've discussed, doesn't necessarily meet our current needs. The language could be clearer. It doesn't address many of the current design issues we see today. So as a result, we have started writing what we're calling policy memos, but perhaps that's not the best title. These are interpretive guidance documents meant to clarify acceptable design criteria based on the existing regulations, including 378. They would apply to small ponds and dams for the most part, and we're hoping that these policy memos can make everybody's life easier by providing a clear pathway for designers and for reviewers and approvers to answer some of these questions that are vague or not very clear in existing regulation. All right, so what does the future hold in terms of laws and regulations in Maryland?
Hey, John.
Yes.
Sorry, we have about 5 minutes left.
All right, we'll wrap it up then quickly. The intent of the original dam safety law clearly remains valid, right? It's protecting public safety and the public interest from the risk that dams posed. We know that the regulations have changed over time, but they have been relatively stagnant. In fact, a recent ASDSO peer review of our state dam safety program identified a few areas of need to align with national best practices and what's known as the model dam safety program. So we're asking ourselves, are the laws and regulations adequate for large linear transportation projects? Are they adequate to address aging dam infrastructure nearing or beyond the end of its service life? Do they handle climate change? How do they handle hazard and risk creep? And how do we adequately handle the shift of technical review to some local stormwater management agencies if that's how a county is proceeding? Your surveys that you've submitted to us through this process have made it clear that MDE can improve. There's issues with timeliness, clarity, and consistency, which in part we're trying to address by some of these guidance documents. You would all like additional training on dams and small ponds, and we're trying our best to offer what we can. Our fall workshop that we've been doing for the past few years will probably happen in January, February of 2021 instead of the fall this year because of this What's in Your Pond series. We've also recommend though that agencies reach out for training on their own, and we can offer some guidance on where to look. ASCE and the Association of State Dam Safety Officials are two resources that offer training at varying levels with varying costs associated with them. And we know that the loss of institutional knowledge and the ability to attract and retain new talent is a problem for all of us. So we are thinking about all of these things, and we're looking for your input on how any of these factors can play into updating laws and regulations in Maryland as it pertains to dams and small ponds. We don't have all the answers right now. We've started some of these interpretive guidance documents where we know that there was a need and we felt like we had a clear grasp on the situation, but there's much more work to be done. Look soon on the dam safety website. We're hoping to post a link for what I'll call an expression of interest. If you're interested and have information or time or guidance documents that you developed that you'd like to contribute to this effort, there'll be a way for you to submit that there so that we can gather teams and committees and work forward in the future. That's all I have. I hope I've provided kind of a framework here of where we started, where we are right now, and where we think we need to be heading. And if we have some time, I'd love to take the opportunity to answer questions that you have right now.
And John, you have 5 minutes.